Very pleased today to introduce our first presenter, who is Sara Mojtehedzadeh. Did I get it? And Sara, I'm sure many of you know Sara and Sara's work. Sara reports on the changing workplace, including precarious work, labor issues, and workers' compensation. Her work at the Star has been recognized by the Hillman Foundation Prize for Social Justice-Oriented Investigative Journalism. She received the JHR Canadian Association of Journalists Award for Human Rights Reporting in 2017. We're very excited. This is sort of our first journalistic presentation, or journalistic research presentation. And we also consider Sara a friend and an ally for injured workers. So help me to welcome Sara.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm going to talk today about an investigation that my colleagues and I worked on over the course of the past year. I've spoken to many of you in this room for that very project, and I'm very grateful to have relied on your insights and your experiences on the world of temp agency work. So I'll start off by telling you a little bit about how we came across this story and what kind of motivated us to pursue this kind of undertaking. I worked undercover at a factory for a month, and the investigation itself took more than a year to complete. And in today's day and age, it's hard to get the kind of resources to go with this sort of project. So a little bit of background on why we embarked on this. So in the United States, ProPublica, which is a well-known investigative organization, had done a big investigation on temp agency workers and how they were being injured at significantly higher rates than permanently hired employees. And so I'd read the investigation, and I was curious to know whether the same thing was happening in Ontario and happening in Canada. And sort of anecdotally, many of the workers who I would speak to in the course of my reporting had told me things like as temp agency employees, they'd been given the more risky work. They'd been injured and not received compensation or struggled to receive compensation. So anecdotally, it seemed like we here in Canada were facing a similar set of problems. But because the data that ProPublica relied on to write this investigation wasn't readily available here, there was no intuitive way to go about a similar type of investigation for me. So I started off by just reading hundreds of court bulletins that the Ministry of Labor issues every time a worker is injured or killed on the job. And in those court bulletins, they note whether the worker was hired through a temp agency or not. And so from that, I isolated the cases where the victim was a temp, and I started to request court transcripts and look into their particular stories. And that's how I came across a factory called Fiera Foods. Fiera Foods is one of the biggest manufacturing employers in the region. It touts itself as one of the biggest industrial bakeries on the continent. And they make pastries for places that we've all probably bought bagels or croissants from: Tim Hortons, Walmart, Metro, Loblaws, Dunkin' Donuts, Costco, lots of really big names. And the story that really sort of grabbed me, which wasn't included in the actual investigation, was a story about a man in 2011 who was killed outside of the factory. He was a security guard who had been hired through a temp agency. And he was crushed to death on his shift. First, he was hit by a worker who was leaving his shift at midnight. And then he was run over by a transport truck that was leaving the facility. The Ministry of Labor later found that the worker hadn't been given protective gear. He didn't have any reflective jackets. There was no lighting in the area, and so there was no way for these vehicles to see him. So obviously an incredibly tragic story, but what really grabbed me about the story was not just the story of this man's death, but the story of the man who hit him in the first place. His name was Marlon Laguyen. He was an immigrant from the Philippines. He just finished, I think, a 12-hour shift at the factory in this low-wage job. And he hit the man and panicked and drove away, and then 25 seconds later realized that he had to go back and help the security guard, but by that point he'd already been run over by a transport truck. So Marlon was tried in court for his involvement in the accident, and as a result had his license taken away. So he couldn't drive, and he was at home, and his baby daughter had an asthma attack. But because his license had been taken away, he couldn't take her to hospital, and the little girl died. Now, that was a story that wasn't included in the investigation, but for me, it really spelled out the sometimes unintended consequences of lax workplace security and safety, not just on an injured worker, but on everyone involved in an accident, and the way that those accidents really have this enormous ripple effect that devastate people's lives. And I know that everyone in this room probably has experience with that, but that was really what motivated me to push on this story and investigate it further. And as I was gathering information about this factory and learning that, over the course of 2 decades, several other temp agency workers had died at the facility, that they'd been slapped with hundreds of health and safety orders, we were sort of putting together this picture of one facility, but also of an economy that's really changing and that is increasingly relying on this form of low wage and very precarious work. So eventually we made the decision that going undercover was really the best way to explore this. And there was 2 reasons for that. As journalists, we have an ethical responsibility to be upfront about who we are and what we're reporting on. And it really takes a very compelling public interest for us to waive that ethical responsibility. And we also have to look at whether there's any other way to tell the story conceivably. And in this case, based on the research that Ellen and Catherine had done of the investigations that had happened in the U.S., we knew that there was a compelling public interest in talking about the unique ways that temp agency workers are vulnerable on the job. But we also knew that these workers are so precarious. They can be let go for no reason at sort of the drop of a hat. And so asking them to speak out and speak publicly about their working environment, we thought was really not feasible. So that's when I turned up at Fiera Foods and asked for a job. And right away, when you arrive at the factory, there's actually a sign at the entrance that says, "Workers with temporary employment inquiries, please come inside." And so it's very apparent the type of job opportunity that's on offer for workers. And sure enough, I went inside the factory and I was told that the factory didn't hire directly, and that I'd have to contact a temp agency to get a job. So I called the temp agency. They asked me a few questions about my immigration status in Canada. They told me to get a pair of safety boots, and 2 weeks later, I turned up at the factory. when I got there, I was essentially given about 5 minutes safety training. I was told that I had the right to refuse unsafe work, and I was told that if I didn't want to do something and there was nothing else available in the factory, that I could go home and wait for the temp agency to call me again. I was told not to put my hand in a machine, and essentially our shift started. There was no screening questions as to what sort of experience I had working in a factory or in an industrial environment. And, you know, this is to paint a little bit of a picture of what the facility was like. It's a huge sprawling factory in North York. It's churning out something like 2 million bagels a day. You are surrounded by heavy equipment, forklifts, etc. The floors are dirty, they're slippery, the bathrooms are dirty. So, you know, some people ask me after the story ran, like, how much training do you really need to work in a bakery? And my response has sort of been like, it's not grandma's bakery, right? Like, this is a factory. It's industrial food manufacturing. And you know, there's industrial ovens there that are baking the goods, and you know, we weren't told where the fire exits were. We weren't told where the fire extinguishers were. And the experience was really interesting for me as a reporter, because I was, you know, experiencing it as a worker who had to keep their job at the factory for enough time to report the story. And so like, so much of my energy was devoted to just keeping up to this incredible pace of working on the production line. And I think, like many workers, that was my preoccupation. It wasn't how do I stay safe on the job. It's how do I keep this job at any cost. And so things like the fire extinguisher and fire exits didn't even occur to me until, you know, a few weeks into the job, when I was walking through one of the corridors, and, you know, you could literally feel the heat from the industrial ovens radiating through the corridor, that I thought I should probably know, you know, where a fire exit is. So that was a revelation for me as a reporter, and it was also eye-opening to see who was doing that work. It was almost without exception new Canadians and people of color. You know, when I would ask people how they liked the job, or sort of get a sense of what they were doing there, the most common response was, you know, I'm here to survive. And I was actually surprised at how candid people were on that front, because my experience as a reporter is that folks usually show tremendous loyalty to their employer. I find usually people approach me as sort of a last resort to talk about, you know, a problem that they've encountered on the job. And almost always give their employer the benefit of the doubt for as long as possible. So I thought it was quite telling that there was this sense of a lack of power and a lack of choice that was so obvious and so sort of on the surface of what we were all doing. I stayed at the factory for a month, and again, really sort of learned why folks were there, and the type of power relationship that existed in that facility, and a power relationship that I think is replicated in a lot of factories and warehouses and places where temp agency work is increasingly relied on. The temp agency industry, when it sells itself or talks about its role in our economy, will often point to the importance of flexibility, not just for the employer, but for the worker as well. And in fact, this was the response that we got from the factory when we approached them with our findings, was that the use of temp agencies was beneficial, not just from a commercial standpoint, but from the standpoint of their employees, who were able to balance their work life with their family obligations. but my observation on the job was, while that may have been true in some cases, and there were some workers there who were balancing their work at the factory with part-time studies or other activities, the power really flowed in one direction. We weren't paid if we were sick, so workers had to choose between losing a day's pay, minimum wage pay, and coming in sick. And of course, we're handling food without gloves or face masks. We had to ask permission even to go to the bathroom. We were constantly shouted at by supervisors. And again, it's low wage work, so people don't have a choice necessarily as to whether they can advocate for themselves or not when it's potentially losing the ability to put food on their table. And almost everyone who I spoke to at the factory was hired through a temp agency. So again, complicating that ability to really advocate for themselves without fear of termination. So for me, the flexibility seemed to go largely in one direction. And I think that for a lot of people, that is what the legislation that's sort of gone through Queen's Park is aimed at addressing, is looking at that power relationship and the financial incentives to maintain that power relationship, and how do we fix that. The last element of the investigation that I wanted to talk about was what happened when I got paid. As I was researching this story, we talk a lot about the triangular relationship, which is between the worker, the temp agency, and the employer, or the client company, the factory. But what I actually found through the investigation was this sort of fourth actor, which was the payday lender, where I ended up having to get my cash wages, which really proved to us why it was so important to go undercover, because there was no way we would ever have found out about this had we not done this exercise. So I was told when I first started at the factory that I had to pick up my cash at another completely unrelated temp agency called GTA Employment. And when I turned up there, it was a payday lender. They handed me an envelope of cash. I asked for a pay stub and was told that the guy didn't know anything about it. He was just there to hand out the money. When I called the temp agency that actually hired me, they told me that they didn't provide pay stubs, they didn't make statutory deductions. When my colleague and I tried to actually find the temp agency that hired me, we found that the listed business address was actually an empty unit in a strip mall. And so for us, this really demonstrated how difficult it can be for workers when something goes wrong. Who do you turn to? Is it the client company, the factory where you're working every day? Is it the temp agency who you've never met and is just a voice on the other end of the phone and you can't find their office? Or is it the place where you pick up your cash, which has no obligation to you seemingly whatsoever? So it's a complicated web for workers to navigate, and what we found through our Freedom of Information request was that many temp agencies seem to be operating like this. When we turn up at their offices, it would be a UPS mailbox service, or an empty plot of land in one case. And of course, there are many agencies who are not operating like this, who are doing things by the book and by the law, and yet they are competing with organizations that are doing none of that, seemingly. So it was very eye-opening for me in looking at how this industry seems to have evolved, and through our Freedom of Information request that we made to the Workers' Compensation Board, it sort of seemed to to corroborate what we were finding, a shift away from temp agency work in kind of traditional clerical environments to more blue collar type jobs. And we found that those workers who were working in those kinds of non-clerical sectors through temp agencies were twice as likely as their comparable non-temp workers to get hurt on the job. So that was my experience reporting on temp agencies and sort of the world of precarious work and this sort of invisible workforce that I think a lot of Ontarians that don't see in their day-to-day. So I guess I will turn it over now to the real experts who've done the research on it.